Hi everyone, welcome to ArtsFest Online and to this afternoon's HoPIN webinar, Contrasts in Print. Presentations will be from the co-directors of the Centre for Printing History and Culture, Dr Caroline Archer and Dr John Hinks. The event will be chaired by Dr Catherine Armstrong from Loughborough University. Just a reminder that this event is being recorded and it is a public platform, so please don't share any confidential information. With all that said, welcome, and over to you, Catherine.
Thanks very much, Claire. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Contrasts in Print. I'm really honoured to be chairing this session today. Just so you know who I am, as Claire said, I'm from Loughborough University, and I'm on the organising committee of the Print Networks conference series, and I'm also co-editor with John Hinks, who you'll be hearing from later, of the journal Publishing History. Let's turn to the matter for today, though, which is we're going to hear two fantastic presentations on important printmakers of the 19th and 20th centuries. First of all, we're going to turn to our presenter, Caroline Archer-Parry, who is going to talk to us about Michel Bouchaud. Caroline is co-director of the Centre for Printing History and Culture. She's chair of the Baskerville Society and professor of typography at Birmingham City University. She's the author of 4 monographs on the history of print and typography, and also the editor of many collections of articles. And I think Caroline's convening power in bringing to public attention research of a very wide range of scholars working in book history and print culture is second to none. So without further ado then, I shall hand over to Caroline, who will talk to us about Michel Bouchaud. And I believe her PowerPoint presentation is about to appear on your screens.
Thank you, Catherine. Claire, if I could have the first slide, please. Thank you very much. So I always think one of the delights of research is you never quite know where it will take you and what you might find. I'm a great believer in allowing distractions whilst working, because serendipity plays a large part in the researching process, and permitting diversions can produce unexpected results. For this talk, I'm going to revisit one of my distractions. It's not a subject about which I know very much, and I've not really followed it through to any great extent, but it's a diversion which has charmed me and hopefully will charm you too. So I do have to apologise for the images. For obvious reasons, I've not had access to my own archive for the last 18 months. So I've had limited resources on which to call on for this presentation, not as plentiful or as high quality as I would like, but hopefully the images will be sufficient to weave their magic on you. And next slide, please. Thank you. So a few years ago, I spent some time in Paris at the Bibliothèque Fournie, which you can see here. If you've not been there, it's a magnificent monument to medieval civic architecture with a whimsical assortment of stone turrets decorated with wolves and monsters. The collection are as magical as the building itself and include a wealth of material on the applied and graphic arts. Its archives relate to the French printing industry. They include traditional and contemporary typographic techniques, printing and paper making, photography and advertising. It also has an extensive collection of printing trade literature and type catalogues, which were the main reason for my visit. So whilst working in the Bibliothèque Fournie, I stumbled across a reference to Ritz 30 typograms designed by Bouchaud for Europe. So not understanding the term typogram, I allowed myself to be sidetracked and discovered an 8-page colour catalogue published in 1931 by the Paris-based type foundry of Deberny and Peignot. The catalogue displayed 30 Galvano stock blocks. Galvano is a French term for electrotype. These Galvanos have been commissioned from the French engraver Michel Bouchaud and produced specifically to accompany the typeface called Europe, which Deberny commissioned, which was Deberny's commercial name for Futura, which had been issued in 1930. These Galvanos were typically Parisian in subject matter, quintessentially French in execution, and characteristically Gallic in spirit, and I thought they were utterly charming. Stock blocks have been around since the introduction of printing and are the precursors of 20th century dry transfer images and computer clip art. They originate from the large pictorial initials used in text openings, which were hand cut in wood or cast in metal. By the 18th century, stock blocks had evolved to include generalized images on a variety of subjects, and were used repeatedly by jobbing printers on posters, handbills, and other general items of ephemera. With the advent of photomechanical processes at the end of the 19th century, electrotyping became a major industry, and process engraving firms produced not only stock designs, but also stock photographic halftones. Next slide, please. Electrotyping was invented in around 1840. It's a chemical method of performing metal parts that exactly reproduce a model, and it was quickly adopted by the printing industry. An electrotype printing plate had a surface made of copper or nickel that was backed with an alloy of tin, antimony, and lead. It could either be flat or curved, according to the kind of press on which it was used. Some were mounted on wood to type height, as you can see here. Others were made as flexible plates. Electrotypes were made by duplicating some form of printing surface, such as type, halftones, or line engravings, or a combination of all those units. The duplicates were highly accurate, were able to replicate particularly fine detail, and the resulting print was indistinguishable from one taken from the original type or engraving. Most European type foundries manufactured electrotypes. In 19th century England, the most popular electrotypes were of crests and ecclesiastical ornaments, Masonic emblems, coats of arms, and stationary sundries. In addition, trade symbols, farmyard animals, ornaments, and tailpieces were all the rage. British electrotypes generally were somewhat traditional in design, decidedly utilitarian in purpose, and generally produced without credit to the artists who created them. They remained popular until the beginning of the 20th century, after which demand for them waned and type founders added comparatively few new designs to their repertoires. It was a different story in France. Next slide, please. Electrotypes, or Galvanos as they were called in France, were especially popular in that country and reached a high level of eloquence in the hands of French engravers. Whilst most 19th century British founders offered customers 20 or 30 pages of electrotypes, some French founders were advertising over 300 pages of Galvanos. The engravings were for infinite design. There were representations of the military services and impressive emblems of the Republic. Sport was well covered, and images of babies, children, and allegorical women ranged from the kitsch to the classy. And quite pleasingly, I saw included, as you can see in the bottom right, images of women printing. There were illustrations of every form of labour and all branches of commerce. Social events were catered for with an impressive array of menus and programmes, and passe-partout were publicised ad infinitum. Catholic France, of course, required a large number of religious subjects, including scenes from both the Old and New Testaments, a bewildering array of crucifixes, and numerous interpretations of the Mass and the Madonna for use on baptismal, burial, and confirmation cards. Next slide, please. Food came a close second to faith in 19th century France, or perhaps sustenance even overtook belief, with hundreds and hundreds of gastronomic images which portrayed, amongst other things, a gruesome multiplicity of strangled, hung, and plucked fowl. Next slide, please. In addition, for a nation particularly obsessed with its health, there were collections of medical images. Dentistry was a distinct curiosity, and there were innumerable Galvanos showing extraordinary collections of false teeth, tools of the dental trade, and bizarre depictions of girls both before and after the fittings of their false teeth. Next slide, please. Fashion, of course, occupied countless pages, with both underwear and overwear demonstrating the full gamut of Gallic elegance, from clogs to corsets. All aspects of French life were depicted in 19th century Galvanos, but although they may have been infinite in quantity and engraved to the highest quality, they all somehow bore the uniform look of a stock image. It was not until the 20th century that type founders began producing Galvanos that were more than mere jobbing necessities. And after World War I, French Galvanos became liberated in appearance, individualistic in design, spirited in execution, and created by designers of note. And in the hands of the Deberny foundry, their status was elevated to the level of works of art. Next slide, please. Deberny and Peignot were 20th century trailblazers of both typeface creation and Galvano production. Anxious to promote modernist aesthetics in all applications of design, and to break away from the styles that had survived World War I, the Paris foundry allied itself with the artistic movements of the day and made connections with key exponents of the Deco and Modernist groups. It employed the talents of A.M. Cassandre and Marcel Jacno to produce free-spirited typefaces such as Acier and Bifur, Film and Scribe. And the foundry was equally liberated when it came to its Galvano designs. Next slide, please. Bernard Nodan was a French painter, designer, caricaturist, and engraver, and one of the first artists commissioned to produce Galvanos for Deberny. Nodan trained as a painter at the École Beaux-Arts in Paris, but in 1904 he abandoned painting to concentrate on designing, etching, and engraving. In the 1920s, Nodan designed a series of Galvanos for Deberny, 16 classically inspired garden vignettes entitled Le Jardin Abandonné, a collection of dreamy, whimsical Galvanos available in 4 dimensions. Next slide, please. The artist André-Edouard Marty was a frequent contributor to the magazines Femina and Vogue. In addition, he produced designs for enamel vases, plates, and jewellery, and also created sets and costumes for the theatre. The influence of the theatre can be seen in the 24 charming Galvanos entitled Fêtes Sirane that he designed for Deberny's 1925 catalogue. These romantic Galvanos, with their poised lines, looked to the 18th century for inspiration. They were recommended for use with the typeface Cochin, which was designed by Michel Bouchaud, which was inspired by the copperplate engravings of the 18th century French artist and engraver Charles Nicolas Cochin. Next slide, please. The Paris-based painter and engraver Dimitri Gallianis was a member of the French intelligentsia and friend of the artists Picasso, Braque, and Matisse, amongst others. He was commissioned by Deberny to design a series of highly individual Galvanos for the foundry. These distinctive images, with strong, stylized lines, confident brushstrokes, modified to a gentle simplification, were designed to accompany the typeface Acier. Designed by Robert Girard, Acier was inspired by the typeface Garamond and was released in England by Stevenson Blake under the name Mazarin. Nodan, Marty, and Galvanos were noteworthies of French engraving, but the most inspired and original of all Deberny's Galvano artists was Michel Bouchaud. Next slide, please. So Bouchaud was born in Nantes in 1902, where he trained as a fine artist, but turned to illustration and commercial art when he moved to Paris in 1925. As Bouchaud wrote, "I was traveling some few years ago in Holland and Belgium, and on one of the journeys was lucky enough to be introduced to the director of the Theatre des Champs-Élysées, who was also connected with a men's fashion magazine, Monsieur. Just about this time, I decided to give up free painting and devoted myself solely to illustration. A new horizon was opened up to me, and I made up my mind to take a commercial career. Availing myself of what I had seen on my travels and of my artistic education, I associated myself with the modern movement of commercial art without altogether breaking away from classical principles." Bouchaud started his commercial career designing calendars and creating deluxe wrapping papers for perfumes. He illustrated for Studio, Monsieur, and Vogue. He produced leaflets for the Peignot department store in Paris, fancy sweet boxes for the Bon Marché, and fabric designs to commemorate 50 years of the Eiffel Tower. I think many of the images shown here may be familiar to you. They've been reproduced ad infinitum on tea towels, aprons, chocolate boxes, and on the postcards found in the tourist shops on the Côte d'Azur. I'm sure you're familiar with the style. In 1931, Bouchaud was commissioned to produce a series of Galvanos for Deberny, and the result was Ritz, 30 typogrammes designed for use with the typeface known as Europe. The Galvanos were first publicised as an 8-page alphabet book with one design to accompany each letter from A to Z, which was set in varying weights of Europe. The designs were full of zest and movement, which made them both great complements and contrast to the rigidity of the typeface against which they were set. Next slide, please. The images Bouchaud chose to create were quintessentially French, not because they depict the Eiffel Tower and Notre Dame, nor because they show Parisian cafes or cancan girls in the Folies Bergère, but because of the manner in which these subjects were portrayed. Bouchaud spent much time in Paris, indulging in the time-honoured French habit of sitting in cafes and watching street life, observing humanity as it passed by and commenting on the world. Bouchaud's pronounced interest in city life canalized itself into the Galvanos, and his designs were visual remarks on the French and their capital, graphical interpretations on metropolitan bourgeois life, and all that comprised the vain face of the French capital. Many of his Galvanos depict life al fresco. It was a conscious and symbolic choice of subject matter, and reflected the fact that much modern applied graphic art in France was first seen on the streets. Bouchaud's Galvanos differ from those of either his predecessors or his contemporaries, as they were produced without any direct historical antecedents and bore few marks of 19th century influence. Bouchaud's Galvanos were original in design, intrinsically contemporary in execution, and showed superb freedom of draftsmanship. The images have the appearance of being drawn rather than engraved, with unambiguous lines made without extravagance. This resulted in simple illustrations that were both stylized and stylish, and which exuded genuine liveliness rather than mechanized animation. They were novel pieces of living art that had great vitality and consciousness of purpose, that radiated mischief and humor, wit and color, which showed a highly developed instinct for fantasy. Bouchaud's images were strongly individualistic, logical on one hand and emotional on the other. And I think his Galvanos were the most imaginative, invigorating, and inspiring blocks in the Deberny catalogue. But it was not merely the originality and quality of execution that made Bouchaud's work stand out. Whilst most 19th century Galvanos were available for use at the customer's discretion and could be employed alongside fonts of their own choosing, those designed by Bouchaud were expressly produced to accompany a single typeface, and the Deberny catalogue was clear in its recommendation to be used for preference with Europe. Next slide, please. In 1929, Deberny and Peignot bought the rights to Futura, a typeface that was originally designed by Paul Renner for the Bauer foundry in Germany. It was Maximilian Vox who recognized Futura's potential as a bestseller and urged Deberny to acquire it. Although Futura was not a favorite with the French type foundry, Deberny began marketing the typeface in 1930 under the name of Europe. In order to merchandise the typeface to its best advantage, Bouchaud was asked to design these series of Galvanos sympathetic to Europe. The resultant illustrations proved to be both an ideal antidote and a perfect echo of the typeface. The lines of the images perfectly complement the weight of the font. The abrupt slants in the illustrations mirrored the sharp angles of the typeface, and the severe points of the images were in emulation of the fierce points of the characters. Next slide, please. The Galvanos were advertised under the name of Ritz. In the 1930s, the Ritz Hotel was synonymous with all things luxurious or elegant in Parisian living, and the epitome of all that was affluent and middle class. As such, it was an eminently appropriate name for a set of Galvanos that depicted the bourgeois and vain face of the French capital. It also represented something of an entente cordiale, a set of Galvanos named after a Swiss hotelier, issued by French type founders and produced to accompany a German-designed typeface that was marketed under the name of the continent in which they all resided. But Bouchaud's designs were more than mere Galvanos with a pan-European significance. They were typogrammes. Next slide, please. Typogram is a curious word whose meaning is the subject of conjecture and which is open to many interpretations. So here's my interpretation. It seems to me that Bouchaud used the term to embrace various notions, including measure, movement, representation, and syntax. Its first connotation is that of a gauge. The lines used to produce the image mirrored the lines of Europe in their weight, and as such, the typograms can be seen as a visual measure of the type. Secondly, I think just as a cardiogram produces a graphical representation of the movement and rhythm of the heartbeat, so the typograms can be said to be a pictorial description of the movement and energy of the font. And I think finally, Bouchaud used his typograms to create a visual grammar and syntax for Europe. The Galvanos were a manifestation of Europe's unspoken language. Next slide, please. Whatever the meaning of Bouchaud's typograms, he undoubtedly produced a range of charming and imaginative images that broke the mold of Galvano design. And I hope you found them as charming and as diverting as I do. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Caroline. That was a fascinating talk. I'm sure many of you have got questions for Caroline, but if I could ask you to hold those until both of our speakers have presented. In the meantime, please do begin to enter your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. You'll see it at the bottom of your screen. It's a little button marked Q&A. We're using that rather than the chat and rather than the raise hand function. So questions in the Q&A section, please, for both Caroline and John, who I shall introduce now. Thank you, Caroline. Let's move on to our second speaker now then. John Hinks is visiting reader in printing history and culture at BCU, Birmingham City University. He's coordinator of HoPIN, the organisation who has initiated today's event. And he's also chair of the National Printing Heritage Committee. With me, he's deputy editor and of Publishing History, and he's also reviews editor of that publication. And he's series editor of Printing History and Culture, which is a series published by Peter Lang. So very much like Caroline, John is at the fore of bringing the research of a wide range of scholars to public attention. So I'll hand over to John now, who's going to talk to us about the work of Sir Francis Seymour Hayden. John.
Thank you, Catherine. Where's it gone? Slideshow, yes, from beginning. There we go. Right. If you haven't heard of Seymour Hayden or you don't know much about him, you can be forgiven because he was very celebrated in his own lifetime, but is much less well known now. I suspect many people won't have even heard of his name, although if you're interested in printmaking history, you may have at least heard his name. What I'm aiming to do in the next half hour is to tell you a bit about Hayden, show you a selection of his prints in case you're not familiar with them, and perhaps to help restore him to his rightful place as one of the leading figures, if not the leading figure, of the British etching revival of the latter half of the 19th century. Seymour Hayden was born into a very comfortably off family in Derbyshire in 1818. He was educated at University College London and at the Sorbonne, Paris, not as an artist, but as a surgeon, which was going to become his career. His father and grandfather had both been medical men too. While he was studying in Paris, studying medicine in Paris, he also attended art classes at one of the art colleges in Paris because he thought it would help him. He was interested in art anyway, but it thought it would help him with his manual dexterity as a surgeon. And he always maintained that his etching activities did indeed help with his surgical activities, and I suppose vice versa as well. Right, two typical etchings, fairly early ones by Hayden. He was, as well as all his other activities, he was very fond of fishing. And so many of his etchings feature rivers and things, landscapes around rivers. He was particularly fond of the River Test in Hampshire, which is where this first one, a water meadow, is. And he also liked going to Ireland as well. And there are quite a few etchings of his landscape in Ireland, also in Wales, though I haven't got any examples of those. It's said that he liked to combine fishing and etching, so he would set off. He was well off enough, and his medical practice was successful enough that he could give himself a few days off when he felt like it, and he would go off to wherever and taking with him his fishing equipment and his etching plates, because he liked to etch from nature, to have a prepared plate and to draw on it out in the landscape. He had first tried etching while he was on holiday in Italy in 1843 in his mid-20s. He didn't then do any more. He was getting his medical career going. He did no more etching until 1857 when he was about 40. These two plates and many of his earlier plates are etched on copper plates, although he later developed a preference for zinc plates. A couple more, one in Ireland, another one from Ireland, one in Oxfordshire. He was fond of the River Thames, the upper reaches of the Thames at this early stage. I said he liked to etch from nature. It's important to remember that Haydn's etchings are original compositions. He drew them on a blank plate. Many engravings and etchings were traditionally copies of paintings, either by the same person or by other people. But this was original etching, which he would always stress. These two are on zinc plates. Right, so you may well know about etching, but this early engraving, as it says in French, shows you how one prints from engraved plates. A very quick potted history of etching. It was originally used for decorating armor, which I didn't know until quite recently, but it's interesting. It was developed for printmaking purposes in the late 15th century in Germany. It then spread fairly quickly across Europe and beyond. It was popular with many artists during the Renaissance. Late 15th century, early 16th century, Dürer was a particularly fine exponent of etching, along with artists like Altdorfer, Peter Bruegel the Elder, and Parmigianino. 17th century, Rembrandt was, and other people in the Netherlands were very keen on etching. Rembrandt was a master of etching. I'll come back to him. In the 18th and early 19th century, Goya was particularly fond of etching and very good at it. Etching, in terms of England, etching was introduced here by Wenceslas Holler, late 1630s. It had been used by the Norwich School of artists, people like Crome and Cotman, late 18th, early 19th century. Gertin was very good at using it. He was very late 18th century, and Turner was also very good at etching. The craft of etching had declined to some extent in England, particularly because other methods had become popular during the latter part of the 18th century. Whether that was enough to talk about what was happening in the 19th century as a British etching revival is, the jury is out on that one, and I'll come back to that thorny question a little bit later on. So here is Haydn, a selfie of Haydn with the paraphernalia of the etching craft, the bottles of acid and such like, and some etching tools from that period on the right, although the etching tools haven't changed much at all. You would still see tools like that in etching being done today. Etching is much easier to do and more expressive than engraving. With engraving, you have to use a tool called a burin. You cut into the metal plate and push it away from you usually. It's quite hard work. But etching uses a plate coated with a wax and resin ground. And then the etcher draws into that ground with needles, as you can see on the right there, which is quite easy. It's much like drawing. It's as easy as drawing on a sheet of paper. But you don't cut into the plate. What cuts into the plate is when you put the plate in a bath of acid, a process called biting, usually nitric acid. Not always, and sometimes these days, for sort of safety and environmental reasons, people tend to use a copper sulfate solution instead, although some stick to the traditional nitric acid. So that eats into the plate where it's not covered by the ground. So where where you've drawn, then that's where it's bitten in, and then the ground is washed off, and the plate is then ready for printing. Engraving and etching are both intaglio methods, as are mezzotint and aquatint, which I'm going to mention very briefly later. And they're not relief methods, which have the prints the raised areas like woodcut, etc. A couple more of Haydn's prints. Sheer Mill Pond was highly praised and was one of his own favourite etchings. The one on the right, it's actually one of my least favourite, but he was fond of it, possibly because it was one of his most successful. It sort of made his fame and fortune, although the fortune bit is debated. One of his early supporters, Hamerton, who we'll look at in a few minutes, said he had made lots of money out of this print, but that's thought to be an exaggeration. Hamerton was a little bit prone to exaggeration and hyperbole. At this stage, 1870-ish, Haydn had begun exploring the lower reaches of the Thames, having previously looked at the upper reaches. This was at Deptford, and it was an old warship being broken up for scrap. This print was published by a print seller called Colnaghi in London at 5 guineas a time, which was a fair amount of money in 1870. It was certainly a lot of money for an etching at that period. From 1870 to 1873, Haydn was busy with his medical career and did no etching at all. But then he got going again. Now, this is Whistler, James McNeill Whistler, who I think you will have heard of, American artist. Haydn was married to Whistler's half-sister, Deborah, always known as Dasher. And Whistler, known in the family as Jimmy, was 13 years younger than Haydn, and he spent a lot of time in his younger days with the Haydns in London, and they got on well. They worked side by side or in the same area quite a lot when they were younger. Whistler's house on the right, in that picture, it's the house that's on the left, almost into the photograph of Whistler in the middle there. That's where the house he rented on the Thames at Chelsea at that time. From the windows of that house, Whistler's house, Haydn did this etching of Battersea Reach on the left. That's Haydn on the left. Whistler on the right, working probably at the same time, certainly the same year, doing an etching called Battersea Dawn. Quite a different sort of style, I think it's fair to say. Haydn was very inspired by Whistler. Whistler was a talented artist, a printmaker. He became more famous later as a painter, of course. I think most people now would think of Whistler as a painter rather than a printmaker, although his famous set of Thames etchings is very, very popular still. There was a wonderful exhibition of it about not quite 10 years ago at Dulwich Art Gallery, which was when I first got interested in Whistler, and then went on eventually to Haydn. The relationship between Haydn and Whistler brings to the fore the question of professional versus amateur, because Haydn was always an amateur. His source of income and his main occupation was surgery, and he was a very successful surgeon, very highly acclaimed, did all sorts of important jobs, government jobs to do with medicine and surgery. Couple more just to contrast the styles of Whistler. This time Whistler's on the left, Haydn on the right. Haydn and Whistler were both very strong personalities. Both had a fairly short fuse, were quite volatile characters. And they started to not get on quite so well around about this sort of time. The critics preferred Haydn's traditional style, which harks back to Rembrandt and maybe even earlier, but similar sort of spacious and soft style. Whistler was trying to do something different and new, and he was tended to put figures in the foreground of his etchings, like this one here of Black Lion Wharf. The technical term is repoussoir, from the French repousser, which means to push back. The idea being, as if you've studied photography, you know that you sometimes put something in the front of the picture to give the picture depth. That's the same idea. But the critics didn't like it, or most of them didn't. A few did. Most of them preferred Haydn, which infuriated Whistler because he was the professional artist of the two. Haydn was just a medic who did a bit of etching in his spare time. So they started to not get on too well, and they fell out permanently and never spoke again in 1867 in Paris, when they had a big disagreement over something or other. And the upshot was that Whistler pushed Haydn through a plate glass window, which is not the best way to cement a friendship. And they never spoke again. And Whistler, although he was younger than Haydn, died before Haydn, and Haydn didn't go to his funeral. He still hadn't forgiven him. Whistler still got on with Lady Haydn, though, his sister, half sister. This is Frederick Golding, a printer. Haydn's views on printing of etchings was that the printer, if possible, the printmaker should print his own prints, because he was the sort of sole creator of them. But this wasn't practical for somebody who was as busy as he was with his other activities. And so he employed a printer. He had learnt printing originally while he was in Paris from a well-known printer called Auguste Delattre. And as I mentioned earlier, I think he had attended classes when he was studying medicine at the Sorbonne. He had plenty of money, Haydn did, so he set up his own printing press in his house, and he always printed his own proofs, often several times, and kept fiddling about changing the plates and having different states of the plates. But of course, if he wanted to do larger quantities, an edition, as they called, of prints, he needed somebody to do the heavy lifting, as it were, for him. And he chose Frederick Golding, who he had met when Golding was still a young apprentice. He'd met him at, I think, at an exhibition. Golding did some etchings himself in between doing printing for Haydn and other people, and the picture on the right is quite a nice etching, I think, that Golding did himself of a scene in Bruges in Belgium. I mentioned Hamerton in passing. He was very important to Haydn as his sort of champion and publicist, if you like, probably before the word had been invented. Haydn's reputation was largely made by Hamerton, Philip Gilbert Hamerton, who you see here. He published this journal called The Portfolio, which publicized and popularized prints of all kinds, ancient and modern, and ran for a number of years. I've managed to find a few volumes of that. They're very nice to look through. There are articles and quite good quality illustrations of prints. They're very well, by the standards of that sort of time, they're very well illustrated. Haydn and Hamerton between them came up with the idea of the etching revival, particularly in Britain, but also in Europe. But the idea has been contentious, and as I mentioned, I'll in fact come back to that in a minute or two. Just a couple of pictures here by Daumier, the French artist, of print collectors. On the left, looking at prints to buy, and on the right, admiring and showing off and enjoying the prints that have been collected. Just reminds us that it was a popular hobby at this sort of period. Haydn spent quite a bit of time in France every now and again. He kept in touch with French artists, particularly close to Deberny and an etcher called Mérion, who did some very nice etchings of urban scenes in contrast to Haydn's rural scenes, very nice etchings of Paris, which are still quite popular. But was there really an etching revival? Well, these three books all talk about an etching revival. The one on the left, published in 1997, suggests that the etching revival ran from 1850 to 1929. The book in the middle, 1999, by Emma Chambers, which I suspect was a PhD thesis and was turned into a monograph. It certainly reads like one, and perhaps would have benefited from being turned into a better monograph, but never mind. She goes back as far as 1838, but stops as early as 1892, which is a bit unusual. And the one on the right, from an American perspective, goes from 1850 up as recently, relatively recently, as 1940. It's difficult to sort of pin it down, but around 1925-26 was thought to be the height of, certainly of an etching boom in popularity. But by 1929, with the Wall Street crash and some quite silly speculation on the part of some people in buying prints as commodities rather than as works of art, on which is something I don't get me started on that, because I get cross about that. And prices plummeted in about 1929, and that was, I think, that was effectively the end of the height of the etching revival. Though it does carry on longer, and there's a lot of etching done, and still is today. It's still quite popular. I've just mentioned the book in the middle again, Chambers. She's quite good on context. She talks about the market, about collectors and networks of collectors, the sort of infrastructure of print collecting, but she's a bit contentious in other ways. I've read some interesting, shall we say, reviews of her book, which I have some sympathy with. Let's just go back briefly to the 17th century, some etchings by Rembrandt, which are lovely, spacious ones. I love those three, but a lot of his landscape etchings are in a similar sort of vein. He was very good at using space and showing space in his pictures. Haydn greatly admired Rembrandt. He collected him. This was a time when you could pick up Rembrandt prints relatively cheaply. Haydn had a huge collection. He worked on them. He studied them. He published books and pamphlets about them. He lectured on them. He organized an exhibition of them. And he was one of the first to attempt to arrange Rembrandt's etchings in chronological order rather than thematically, which was the normal way at that time. And Rembrandt greatly influenced Haydn's own style. And I think you can see that here in these couple of Haydn prints of Erith Marshes and the Sunset on the Thames. Another river scene. This was the Erith, the lower reaches of the Thames again, and Sunset on the Thames on the right there. Both done on zinc plates, but I particularly like Sunset on the Thames. I think he's captured that to capture that sunset in monochrome, I think is quite an achievement, and maybe only etching could do that quite as effectively compared with other printmaking methods. In Haydn's day, the Royal Academy, the RA, would not accept etchers, on the whole, didn't accept original etchings. They thought etching was a craft and not an art. They were a bit uppity about it. So Haydn set up what became known as the RE, in contrast with the RA. The Royal, it started off as the Society of Painter Etchers. This is his London house in Mayfair. He was, as I said before, he was quite wealthy. It didn't always make him popular with other artists who were struggling and in a garret, wondering where the next meal or drink was coming from. And he was living in the lap of luxury in the West End of London. But never mind, he can't help that. And in his living room in that house, he set up the Society of Painter Etchers, 31st of July, 1880. It changed its name a number of times. It was given the royal prefix by Queen Victoria, who herself, with Prince Albert, was an amateur, keen amateur etcher. Did you know that, I wonder? The term painter etcher is misleading. It was then and it still is. What it means is not a painter who etched, but somebody who etched or made prints in a sort of painterly style. Giving an address in 1891, Haydn explained, and this is a quote, "All forms of engraving are all forms of engraving on metal, whether by the burin, that's the engraving tool, the etching needle, by mezzotint or aquatint, or by whatever form the artist may choose as a means of original expression, are understood to be included in the term painter etcher. So it's stressing this originality rather than copying idea again. On the right is a history of the Royal Society of Painter Printmakers, which is still going today, based in the Bankside Gallery on the south bank of the Thames. I put that on mainly because it reminds us that they did include women as members, which wasn't a given at that time. That they did have women members. This is Laura Knight, a picture by Laura, an etching by Laura Knight on the front. There were also other eminent etchers and printmakers, Gwen Ravarat, who was primarily a wood engraver, Constance Pott and Dorothy Woolard, who came along a bit later but was in her own way an eminent etcher. A couple more prints. This Greenwich one is unusual for Haydn because it's very detailed. He usually goes for a more impressionistic sort of style. This is, as you can see, is quite detailed. It was a large plate and it was intended for publication, which his earlier work hadn't been. He was just doing it for his own amusement, really. But he started, I suppose, to realize that he could make money out of it and that people wanted to buy his plates. So this was intended for publication. Another one on the right, another Irish one, rather a nice one. This is etching and dry point. Dry point is often used alongside etching or in combination with etching to get a bit of variety into the plate. Dry point is where you just draw on the metal plate without any ground, or having done the etched plate, cleaned off the ground, you can then do adjustments with dry point. Here are a couple of ones he tended to turn to just doing dry points, which doesn't involve the wax ground at all. You just, as I just said, you do it straight onto the plate. So that's quite a nice thing to do. He did very few etchings after about 1880. 1877, this the year of these two, or thereabouts. He was very prolific. He did 39 plates in that year, and he did 16 during a fortnight spent in Dorset, of which these are 2 examples. By this time, he was getting on for 80. Towards the end of the century, he was approaching 80. His eyesight was failing, and he found etching a bit of a trial. And he turned to mezzotint, which these are 2 rather nice examples of mezzotint, which are a quite different style. It wasn't his natural medium. It's a bit slow. It can be very slow and rather tedious. But he found this was a way of expressing himself in print without the trouble of etching, which was such a strain on the eyes. The one on the right of the deer, an early riser, he wrote to Goulding, his printer, suggesting some colour. I mean, usually these are printed in black or brown or close to black. But he said use more brown in the ink or a strong black with a pinch of orange or chrome yellow. One of the few examples I've seen of his instructions on colouring of his prints. I'm going to skip a couple of slides because I'm getting a bit short of time. Haydn in France, I can come back to that if you're interested. You can ask me in the question session. Likewise, Haydn in the USA, come back to that because I want to get on to this, which is his catalogues of his work. His work was catalogued in his own time, which is fairly unusual to have a catalogue published. 1880, Drake's catalogue. Harrington, the year he died, 1910, Naseby Harrington, did this quite thorough catalogue of his complete work. A nice volume by Salomon, 1923. That's a nice one to get if you want to look at Haydn's etchings. There's some very nice reproductions in there, some photogravure ones, not all of them, but some of them are, which are very nice reproductions. And then the modern catalogue raisonné by Schneiderman, 1983, revised 1997. If you want to follow up on Haydn, the main collections of his prints in this country are in the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum. In the States, there are major collections in New York Public Library and at Buffalo, New York State, in the Albright Knox Art Museum. Archives on Haydn, there is the RE, the society he founded, still based at the Bankside Gallery, has an archive which includes a lot of things relevant to Haydn. There's some relevant stuff at the Bodleian Library, the British Library, and the University of Glasgow has an archive mainly relating to Whistler, but because of the overlap between their careers, there is quite a bit of Haydn stuff there. Okay, so here's another photograph of Haydn and an etching by somebody else, not by Haydn, of his country house. When he retired from medical practice, he retired to his beloved Hampshire. He was very fond of the River Test, as I mentioned earlier. And this is Woodcote Manor, which I found out today. I Googled it, and it's now, you can rent a flat in there if you want to, at some exorbitant rent, but it's still there, and looks a very nice building. His character, I've mentioned, he ran on a rather short fuse. He was very irascible. He ran the RE with a rod of iron. He wasn't exactly a Democrat. I think he saw himself, particularly once he'd moved to his country house, he saw himself, I think, as a high Tory country gentleman. And it was very unwise to mention something like Irish Home Rule in his presence, because he would storm out of the room and be very, very cross. He was very fixed in his views and didn't like anybody who had different views. Very quickly, a couple of exhibition catalogues. 2001 on the left at the Hatton Gallery in Newcastle. On the right, the RE did an exhibition. Note that these both mention Whistler and Haydn. Also the one on the right, Samuel Palmer, who I haven't had time to mention, who was a bit earlier. So he was still this, in this century, people do still know about Haydn and his role in the print, the etching revival, if there was one. There's the portrait again. Jackham Hood, who was himself an engraver, not a particularly, an etcher, not a particularly well-known one, had some interesting stories of Haydn, if I had time to go into them, which I don't. In the centre, if you want to, I can't resist it, if you want to see more of Seymour Haydn, have a look at this online resource from the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. I've put it up there, but if you Google amateur etcher of distinction, you'll find it. It's quite an extensive catalogue with essays about him. It's like a free book. As far as I know, it's only available online. You can't buy it in print. On the right is a more recent book by Robert L. Lewis. I don't know who he is, and I wish he'd had his book checked by somebody who could pick up the typos. There are at least 2 or 3 typos on every page. Otherwise, quite a useful book. It's okay, but the Fitzwilliam one is the one to go for. Okay, pretty much out of time. So the last word we'll leave to Haydn, to show that he was a true amateur in the sense of loving his work. This was an etching of his own hands, doing some etching, with this quote from Horace, which is usually translated as "Oh, sweet solace of our work," which suggests that he was, I think, a fairly happy bunny doing his etching. He really loved what he was doing, a true amateur. That's it, the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Really interesting talk again. We've had a few questions for both speakers in the Q&A box. If anyone else has questions that they'd like to ask, please do type them under the button marked Q&A at the bottom of your screen. But let's get started with questions. I'll field them to the speakers, and I'll have a few questions for Caroline, and then a few questions for John, and so on. We've got about 25 minutes, so plenty of time. So let's start with a question for Caroline, if you're there at the moment. Caroline?
I'm here.
Brilliant. So the first question is from Johan de Zerta. asking a question about definitions, asking whether the Bouchaud work that you showed are indeed Galvanos rather than line engravings. I wonder if you could say something about the definition of the two and what makes you define them as Galvanos.
Yeah, thank you, Johan. Thanks for the question. I haven't seen these things, so I can't verify with my own eyes that they were in fact Galvanos. However, Deberny and Peignot did advertise them as Galvanos, so I'm going to take that at face value that they are indeed Galvanos, as that is what they were advertised at. But of course, the Galvano is simply a duplicate of a printing surface. So whether that printing surface is Anders type, whether it had come off a linotype machine or a monotype machine, whether it was a photo engraving or whether it was a line engraving, the Galvano is a duplicate of one of those printing surfaces or a combination of all those printing surfaces together. So certainly at one point, the images that we were seeing were probably line engravings, which have then been translated into Galvanos. And when you just see the final reproduction, you cannot tell whether it's come directly from a line engraving or whether it's come from a Galvano. I think it would be very, very hard pushed to tell the difference. That's the whole point of the Galvanos. They are just such very good quality that you wouldn't tell the difference between the original and between the duplicate.
Thanks, Caroline. And another question for you about the method of Bouchaud. Were his images drawn and then photo engraved or engraved by hand on a printing surface? And that question is from Guy Lawley.
Thank you, Guy. I guess this really relates to the question that Johan asked, which is about that process. I've got no evidence or understanding that Bouchaud was an engraver himself. I could be wrong, because at the beginning I haven't done lots of research into this. So I imagine the process would be that Bouchaud would have drawn the images, pen on paper. An engraver would have interpreted those lines as a line engraving on a metal surface, and then the Galvano would be made from that.
Thank you. Question for John now. This is from Guy Lawley as well. John, would you like to tell us a little more about Victoria and Albert's etchings? Really interesting nuggets. And do you have a source on that particular royal hobby?
I don't really. It tends to just pop up here and there as you're reading about other printmakers. No, I don't. I mean, the Queen and Prince Albert were quite artistic in an amateur, dilettante sort of way. They certainly were taught painting by Edward Lear. I recently read Jenny Uglow's wonderful biography of Edward Lear, and it describes how, I think it was at Osborne on the Isle of Wight, how he was sort of summoned to teach Victoria how to, and I suppose was Albert still around then, I'm not sure, how to paint or draw or whatever, and how nervous he was, although he was quite famous as an artist and a writer himself. As to their printmaking, no, I don't know much more about it. I don't know of a source. As I say, it just tends to be mentioned as an aside. They're just a kind of footnote in the history of printmaking, really. But it's nice to, it's interesting to know that they were involved.
Thanks very much. Another question for you, John, from Guy, asking you specifically about the dry points. Guy asks whether it's correct that dry points yield a very limited edition of impressions. Perhaps you could say a little bit more about that method.
Yes, that's quite correct. They do. Dry point's quite nice. I've only dabbled in printmaking myself, and I enjoyed making dry points. I made quite a few dry points. Never took to etching. I'm not keen on messing with chemicals, and I don't like things that are too sort of involved in process. I like something more direct, which dry point is, because you just draw on the plate print it, and that's it, which is nice. Yes, they do, because when you do a dry point, it pushes up a bit of the metal. It's like ploughing a field. It pushes up either side. Sorry, I'm doing things with my hands that you can't see. There I am. It pushes the metal up in a kind of little furrow, which is called a burr, which makes a nice velvety line that's quite typical of dry point. That's how you recognise a dry point, is that it has this sort of soft edge to the line. The difference with engraving is that you chop off the bits of metal because you're pushing away from you with the burin, so you get a curl of metal at the end of the line, which you just chop off and burnish down so that's gone. So yes, because of this burr, that is actually quite fragile, so you don't get too many prints off a dry point, compared with an etching, which, if it's done well, can print quite a large edition. So yes, Guy is quite right there.
Thanks very much, John. Question for Caroline now. Could you tell us a little bit more about how and under what conditions Paul Renner's Futura was sold to the French type foundry, and whether he was aware and in favour of the name change that occurred? That's a question from Sabine.
Hi Sabine, thank you very much for the question. I'm afraid I really don't know much about the conditions around Paul Renner's typeface being sold to Deberny, or about the name change. He would certainly have been aware of it. And it was very common fairly common for foundries to change the names of the typeface. So Futura, yes, told you already, Deberny and Peignot changed the name to Europe. The American type founders and Linotype called Futura, what they called Spartan was the name Linotype, and ATF gave the same typeface. So it's a fairly common thing for type founders to change names, in the same way that Marathon Bar became Snickers. You know, it's to make these things more marketable for the country and the language that you're selling them in. And indeed, printers themselves in their type specimen catalogues would often change names of typefaces. The Peignot press that I was interested in, the typeface from Klingspur, was originally called Shaded Black, and I've seen the Peignot press marketed in their type specimen books under 5 different names over the course of sort of half a century. So it's not uncommon to change names. I would refer you though to, there's a book by Chris Burke as a monograph that Chris Burke wrote about Paul Renner. So I'm sure he will give more details about conditions of the sale of the typefaces to the various other foundries.
Thanks, Caroline. A second question for you from Janelle Rebel. In the catalogues, are the artists that you mentioned credited when they were commissioned to create Galvanos? So were their designs marketed with their names, or were they presented anonymously like a stock illustration?
No, but because these were names, it benefited Deberny to be able to publicise that they were working with these people. And in fact, the images I showed from Bernard Nodan had actually got his name within the image itself. So anytime anybody reproduced that image, his name was carried on it. But certainly in the specimen books, they were all credited.
Thanks very much. Another question for John now about the mezzotints that you showed towards the end of your talk. Do you know whether Haydn had his plates prepared for him to avoid effort and eye strain, perhaps, and then worked into the black?
Good question. I don't know for sure. I can't give a definitive answer on that. I suspect he probably did, because preparing a mezzotint plate, it's not something I've ever done, but I know how it is. I've seen it done. It's a very tedious business. You use a tool called a rocker, which puts little tiny indentations in the plate, and you have to rock over the whole plate with this little thing. It can take literally hours and hours, if not days, to do a large one. So I suspect he wouldn't have had time, and maybe his eyesight wouldn't have been up to doing that. So yeah, good question. Sorry, I can't give a very straight answer, but if I had to guess, I would guess yes, somebody else prepared them for him, but I don't know for sure.
Thanks, John. And another question from you from someone who's remaining anonymous. Sometimes in Haydn's contemporaries' works, there are small etchings appear in the lower margins. Did Haydn ever do those, and what do you think their purpose was?
That's an interesting question. I think I know what the question means. Haydn was an inveterate tinkerer. He would do lots of fiddling about with his plates. He often put instructions or notes to himself, would engrave them in. When he was working from nature straight onto a plate, looking at, at a river or something, he would make a note about, make the trees dark or something like things like that. And sometimes these would appear as little things. He would then stop them out on the final plate so they didn't print. But sometimes, if you look at proofs of his earlier states of his his etching, you will see these little squiggles and things. So I guess that's what they mean. I don't know otherwise. I don't think anybody else would have been allowed to add anything to his plates. I think they would have had their hands slapped in no uncertain terms, knowing what Haydn was like.
Thanks very much, John. Question for Caroline from Elaine Jackson. Is there any evidence that Michel Bouchaud's designs were used for dust wrappers?
Actually seen any evidence that his designs were used at all anywhere yet. I don't know, I hope they were, because I find them so lovely. If anybody ever sees these things used in any circumstances, I'd be very, very happy to know about it.
Thanks, Caroline. Another question for John. Question about the etching revival, insofar as there was an etching revival in the second half of the 19th century. Was this part of a general recalibration of the value of printmaking in reaction to raging mass production?
Another very good question. Yes, thanks, Joanna, for the question. I think probably yes. I mean, it's not something I've gone into in a lot of detail, but that sounds like a sensible explanation to me. The little book I mentioned at the end by Robert Lewis talks about prices and such like, and the big book, the blue one by Emma Chambers, goes into the market a lot. I think I'd have to reread parts of that to answer that question more fully. But yes, I think probably that's a reasonable explanation of how the etching revival, assuming there was one, I think there was to some extent, although it may have been overstated by some people. I think that's a sort of as good an explanation as any. I think it is part of something bigger, probably. And printmaking, all sorts of printmaking, new methods were coming along. It was getting quite popular at professional and amateur level. So I think, yeah, that's part of the bigger picture. Yeah.
Thanks very much, John. Just to say to our audience that we do have time for a few more questions if anyone has got anything that they'd like to type into the Q&A. John, could I just ask you a quick question? You almost answered it there, but perhaps I could ask you to say a little bit more. Do you think that there was an etching revival, and can you tell us chronologically when you think it was positioned?
I think there probably was. Yeah, I think it was overstated. I think to some extent, Haydn, aided and abetted by Hamerton, kind of exaggerated it for their own purposes. So I think we are part of a revival. I think this is something you might want to do as a kind of marketing tool, I suppose. I think it started around the middle of the 19th century. It goes on till, I mentioned the Wall Street crash, was that 1929. It tails off then, but it does carry on for a bit after that. I mentioned Dorothy Woolard in passing. She goes later than that. I think she goes up to middle of the 20th century, if not a shade beyond, and was quite an eminent etcher. But a revival is a difficult thing to pin down. It's like all these terms that historians and art historians use, like Renaissance and, you know, early modern, medieval. What do they mean? I mean, you know, things happen when they happen, and time isn't carved up neatly into slices that are convenient for historians coming afterwards. We make the best we can of what we try and make sense of when things change. But yeah, for my money, yeah, roughly 1850-ish to 19. I mean, maybe up to the Second World War at a push. And I mentioned the book from the American perspective, where it perhaps did go on a bit longer, I suspect. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Okay, last call for any questions from our audience.
Just to thank the audience for the questions that have come through. They've been very, very good questions. And also for me to say thank you to Claire, because I had technical problems right at the beginning of this. So they were very calm in helping me out. And thank you to Claire for pushing my slides for me.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Yes, and thank you for the questions, and thank you from me to Claire and Hope for their support. Thank you to the University of Wolverhampton. They're always very good at supporting these and running these HoPIN events for us, which is very good of them, and they do it extremely well. So thank you from me.
That's very kind. Thanks both. Thank you, Catherine, for chairing. Thank you so much both for your presentations. It's always a really, it's a real pleasure to have you guys on. We hope you enjoyed that at home. Our next ArtsFest Online event is Tuesday, the 15th of July at 7 p.m. and is a talk by artist Tom Hinks, otherwise known as Black Country Type. This talk is part of our Festival of Britain season in collaboration with the Black Country Studies Centre, and you can book for free through Eventbrite, so head over to there and find some other good stuff too. Hope to see you there. Thanks for watching. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye everyone.